Right, well, thank you for sticking around for the Q&A. I'd like us all to welcome our guest for tonight, Gabriella Coleman. Gabriella Coleman holds the Wolf Chair in Scientific and Technological Literacy at McGill University. Trained as an anthropologist, her scholarship covers the politics, cultures, and ethics of hacking. She's currently working on a book of essays about hackers and the state. And she is also putting the finishing touches on Hack Curio, a curated ensemble of hacker-related videos accompanied by short reflections about the featured clip. Committed to public ethnography, she routinely presents her work to diverse audiences, teaches undergraduate and graduate courses, and has written for popular media outlets, including the New York Times, Slate, Wired, Huffington Post, and The Atlantic. And she sits on the board of the Tor Project. So welcome. So I will just be starting the discussion by asking Gabriella a couple of questions, and then we will hand it over to you all. There will be 2 mics walking around the room, and so if you just raise your hand, people will see you and you can ask your questions. So just to get us started, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about how you got involved in studying and just in general involved in hacker culture and activism.
First of all, thanks for having me. I think this is a really superb series in Montreal, so it's always great to be here. I'm an anthropologist, and when I decided to turn to the cultures of hacking back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, my decision was very heretical, insofar as anthropologists tended to not study their own society as much. But I was fascinated. I was fascinated by one thing at the time, which was open source software, which I talked a little bit about. But it wasn't simply that these computer hackers were writing open source software, things like Linux or Firefox, but that they had created a legal mechanism, licenses, in order to protect and open up this knowledge. I thought it was weird that a bunch of kind of nerd engineers also hacked the law and created legal mechanisms. So that was my way in, and that was my first project on free and open source software. And then as I got to know the hacker world better, I was really floored and amazed by the kind of variability of hacking. People who wrote cryptography tools, people who secured systems, people who broke into systems. And then basically I decided I had worlds upon worlds to study, and I've never left.
Thanks. And you're also interested in your work in the political sensibilities of hackers. So if you could just talk a bit about that in general.
Sure. Hackers, like I had mentioned, are diverse, right? And some care about politics and others do not. But you do see a kind of overwhelming commitment to free speech and privacy in different ways. This is kind of, these are touchstones in the hacker world, and the movie reflected that, right? People who are writing tools like Tor in order to provide a measure of privacy for the public. What's interesting is that while I think a lot of people portray hackers as primarily libertarian, and we got a little bit of that in the film as well, I actually think it's a bit more complicated than that. You really have this interesting variability where you have hardcore leftist, anti-capitalist hackers in places like Italy and Spain, or some of those hackers helped create indie media, for those that know about the sort of big bang of citizen journalism that was built up in 1999. We're in the 20th anniversary. You have kind of liberal-minded hackers. So there's really a whole spectrum. What I find interesting is that certain projects, such as Tor, allows people with different political sensibilities, people who are, left, people who are liberal, those who are libertarian, to kind of work together. There are limits. Where, for example, in Tor, if you were a Nazi, you'd be kicked out, which is a very good thing. But it's a kind of complex terrain where you have this commitment to civil liberties, but then you do have this political variability as well.
Okay, thank you. So are there any questions?
I mean, I think you've laid out the problems very well. It was sprung upon us. It kind of came out of nowhere, I think, and I think it's very ironic for a city like Montreal, which has problems with things like potholes, and then they're trying to roll out the smart city. And all I could say is that I think it's worth pushing against it. It's an issue that I think the city can put its resources better elsewhere. And because of the dangers that you already pointed out, like surveillance, it's not even worth going in that direction. I mean, another way of phrasing what you raise is that, there's hundreds of political problems in the world, right? And some of them are very different. And in some ways, like, why care about this versus other ones, right? I mean, that's maybe one way of phrasing what you have to say. And I think I'm just going to speak from the developer perspective. Sorry, I'm coughing. I'm getting over a cold. Which is this. It doesn't quite answer your question, but hopefully I'll get at it through a different, through a back door. Bad joke. So, I mean, what's interesting to me as an anthropologist is that a lot of these technologists that you saw in the film could very easily just be making a lot of money in the AI industry here, a big corporation. They have enormous access to economic opportunities. And what's interesting to me is that they decide to kind of work towards emboldening civil society through technological production. This is their passion, and this is their skill. And, power to them that they're doing that. And actually, let's think about the conditions that lead them to do this work and not other work. You see what I'm saying? And while it is true that maybe members of the public shouldn't necessarily care about this issue versus other issues, I do think the question of surveillance is ubiquitous and also crosses the rural-urban divide in some pretty dramatic ways. If you are a young kid growing up in a rural area where you can't express your sexuality for fear of harm, being online is a place where you might be able to find a community in order to kind of have refuge and connection until you could find yourself in a safe place. And some of these technologies allow you to do that safely, right? It's not going to solve all of the world's problems, but it's interesting to think about, again, why these technologists who could just make a lot of money decide to channel their labor towards civil society. And again, I think that there are advantages to having them for even rural populations. Well, I don't know. They're concerned about our technologies. They just banned all American, I don't know if it was North American technologies, which is very interesting. I think that most of our technologies are surveilled. Whether it comes from our own governments or outside governments, right? And we do have to think about systems that provide what I think of as pockets of autonomy and privacy. I'm not sure we could create a full-fledged infrastructure that provides these protections, but that's one of the great things about software, is if you compare it to physical infrastructure, it's not like we could just rebuild the city of Montreal to make it more friendly for people with disabilities. We can push and change the legal and legislative process in order for that to happen. But with software, people can come together and just decide to build a tool that then, like Tor, becomes ubiquitous, right? So yes, it's a concern, but I wouldn't just place it on China, but on all kind of superpowers that have an interest in surveilling their population and the populations of others as well. So the AI ethics question, it's a big one, and it is important to discuss because Montreal is a hub of activity, both in terms of researchers from University of Montreal, especially McGill, and then companies like Facebook, which have set up labs here. And what is interesting about this moment, I think, is on the one hand, there is a lot of talk of ethics, which I generally think is positive but doesn't have a lot of teeth or bites insofar as really ensuring that AI is constrained. I don't think it's going to go away. It's got some positive uses, but it does need to be kind of, there has to be a kind of check and it has to be constrained and regulated. What I do think is interesting about this moment is that because it is talked about, because there's these declarations, because it's in the news, in a way that 10 years ago, when a lot of people in the hacker community were talking about surveillance, everyone's like, it didn't have a place to stick. And so I think what has to happen now is that this commitment to ethics has to be converted into something with muscle. And there are some initiatives, for example, AI Now, which is in New York City, is one which is kind of functioning like a watchdog. You need groups of people who are willing to kind of expose the problems with AI and then have mechanisms where people can push against actual applications. And just to finish on a kind of positive note, maybe go back to the smart city, is that certain cities like Oakland have banned surveillance cameras, which also rely on AI. And I think Montreal needs to do the same, and other cities need to do the same. I would say indefinitely, but certainly until the technology has been worked out a little bit better, because currently the technology promises certain things and routinely fails to deliver on those promises. No, that's a great question. And, the short answer is no. There are very different conceptions, and definitely in North America and parts of Europe, the forms of privacy that tend to receive the most, or are given the most attention, tend to be very individualistic at times, right? It's a rights-based model, and is limited in that way, right? And different societies certainly have different conceptions of privacy. I do think, though, that most people, for better or for worse, live under a nation-state regime, and that governments will often abuse very different types of groups of people. And so in that sense, providing tools for privacy and anonymity is not simply just to engender a sphere of privacy for individuals, but does help to protect groups of people as they sometimes fight for their collective rights, as they fight for the states, as they fight for autonomy as well. And just, to give an example, from Canada, we know that the government has often targeted both Indigenous groups and environmental groups with surveillance, right? And something like these technological tools are not a panacea, right? Especially because you have informants, and when you have a human in the mix, it doesn't matter what technological tools you have, right? But nevertheless, there are many instances where these technological tools can provide a measure of control in the transmission of information, in organizing, that is as important for very different types of collectives as it is for individuals. But it is very important to portray those different messages of privacy and anonymity, I think, as people are advocating for their protection and proliferation. So, who here has heard of Signal before? Okay, not bad, not bad. So Signal is an end-to-end encrypted text program, and you could also make free phone calls as well, when you're connected online, which is nice. And it's extremely easy to download and use. And I just encourage all people to use it, just because it supports Signal and ensures their kind of long-term viability. And their long-term viability means that those people, like journalists who use Signal all the time, it means that they will continue to have access, right? So you personally may not need Signal when you're texting, your mom or your kid, but it actually creates a kind of collective and commons that then helps those who need that tool. So Signal is a great one. Another one is the Tor browser, actually. If you're searching for information that you want to keep private, or you don't want Facebook and other companies to be collecting your data, Tor browser is now very easy to use and download, maybe a little bit slow at times. You could also use private viewing in Firefox, which relies on Tor as well. And I think it's important for people to, continue to choose these tools, both to support them, to ensure that they're viable in the future for future generations. But also, the more that they're kind of common, it becomes harder for governments to sort of argue against their elimination. Because every once in a while, the FBI, for example, in the United States, will say, okay, we are not going to outlaw encryption, but we're going to require backdoors. And the second that you have legally mandated backdoors for these technologies, they're not as secure anymore. And the more people use them so that they become part of our social infrastructure, the harder it will become for the government to mandate those legal backdoors. Oh yeah, thank you. Actually, that's a good thing, because, another very exciting thing about the present moment that is connected to these tools is that it is easier to whistleblow anonymously than ever before. Because if you're a whistleblower and you come out in public, your reputation will be dragged through the mud. You'll be crucified and sacrificed. That's just what happens with whistleblowing. So a lot of journalistic outfits now have something called Secure Drop, which runs on Tor and allows you to give information anonymously. But that said, anyone who wants to give information anonymously better do their research and their homework, because achieving true anonymity and true security is actually not easy. You need multiple tools. It's very easy to mess up. It's best to read a lot, go to security trainings, know what you're doing, and know that there's always a risk that you'll be exposed, right? And with something like Tor as a project, while technology is its main focus in terms of the development and ensuring that the network is robust, they've now begun security trainings in different places of the world, because that's just as important. Security is a process, it is not a tool. There's security thinking, and one has to be really accustomed to security if you truly need it. So there's lots of limits, actually. Even as they can be quite handy, they're not like a one-stop solution by any means. Yeah, I don't see them as incompatible, even though, in the hacker community, Jake Appelbaum, who was a core member of Tor, was outed as an abuser, and actually there were many members of Tor who did that work of exposing him. And Richard Stallman has also been kind of called out in numerous ways for being creepy and very inappropriate. And there was a big event, which I won't go into the details. I'll just stick to your question, which is, I think these tools are not meant to then argue everyone should be anonymous and that there shouldn't be consequences for your action, right? That will happen and that should happen. And in fact, these tools in some cases allow you to reveal that information that needs to be revealed. And in fact, what was so interesting about the Appelbaum case was that initially the people who got together to publicize the information, they did so anonymously. And a lot of people supported that and a lot of people didn't support that. I supported that. I was like, they want to be anonymous. I believe that. And they are exposing abuse by someone who was powerful, right? So anonymity for the weak, transparency for the powerful, for institutions, for governments. And these tools allow you to do that, right? And that's why I think they're important. What's sad was a lot of these people who had exposed him were not believed until they were de-anonymized. And they chose to de-anonymize themselves. Most of them did, because people wouldn't listen to them, right? And so it goes back to this problem where if you're speaking anonymously, oftentimes you garner a bad reputation. And there are limits to what people can say anonymously insofar as, you know, your reputation often helps with claims, but I think we do have to have a space where people can call out abuse anonymously as well. I mean, I think many issues require, as you kind of noted already, awareness and literacy and teaching people, and so it's a kind of constant process. Obviously, when it comes to technology, there's this kind of added layer sometimes of technicity and details that makes it a little bit harder. And so I just think that it needs to be taught in the classroom, which is what a lot of kind of professors who work in this area do. And you know, there's no way around the hard work of just keeping up that political work, which is on the one hand of organizing and on the other hand of getting people on board, which means teaching them these issues. And it was great to see so many people here tonight for this film, because I was like unsure. I was like, ooh, a nerdy film. Is anyone gonna come out? It's raining outside. And it's so great to see so many people here. And I do think we've reached this interesting tipping point between things like Anonymous, the hacktivist movement, the Facebook scandals, and a few other issues, including Russian hacking, where people are really getting that in order to follow certain political issues, you also have to follow and care about technological issues as well.
All right, well, thank you. Let's end it here. We can thank Gabriella.
Thanks for coming out.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. And stay tuned for next semester's screenings in early January. Thank you.